guys? Welcome back to a brand new episode. So, for today, we are going to finish the Dragula season finale another day. Just wanted to get the ball rolling again with some movie reviews. This one isn't going to be as in depth. We're not going to go through all of the scenes and the interpretations and everything, but we are going to be referencing it and looking at some stuff from it. But today's video is more so kind of focusing on the cultural side of horror and how it functions as like a narrative for where society is at that time, but also where society is going. And currently, we're seeing a large influx of religious horror. And it's not like just this year, but 2024 was a very specific year, I think. I would say Conjuring time kind of it begins to spark that fear again that people have when it comes to religious themes, I guess. Not that Conjuring is necessarily directly religious horror, but religion plays a huge influence in those movies. Now we're starting to see horror that's directly related to the religion, and the religion is the horror itself. We saw that before in like the 60s/70s. I wouldn't say too much 60s because that's really just like Rosemary's Baby. But the 70s were a really ignited time in society, just culturally, specifically here in America. It was a very heated time period, and I think that shows through the films that came out during that time. You have the original Wicker Man, The Exorcist, The Omen, Carrie, and then of course those spawned different remakes and whatnot. Amityville Horror is also considered religious horror. It was really a time of significant change and of deep internal fears that society had was starting to bubble up, and I just find it very interesting that it, I guess, exposes itself in the form of religious horror. And with 2024 being such a fundamental year, I would say, for horror in general, but also religious horror, you have Immaculate, like we're going to be talking about a bit today, but you also have a remake of The Exorcist, a remake of The Omen, and there are probably countless other religious horror movies that came out in 2024. It's something that I don't think is ever going to escape our society, but I do find it just interesting and worth noting that when huge societal upheaval or unrest starts to really happen, the movies reflect that through this genre. And we will be referencing Julia Kristeva, Powers of Horror, and The Monstrous Feminine by Barbara Creed, just because some of the direct references in Immaculate, I think, works well with what some of the literature pertaining to it is about. So yeah, we'll check that out. All right, so Immaculate, released March 22nd, 2024 by Neon and Black Bear Productions, directed by Michael Moen, written by Andrew Lobel. It had a budget of about 9 million USD, and the box office, it got about 23 million. Not bad. 5.8 out of 10 on IMDb. I thought it was a good movie, but it's not necessarily super exciting, I guess. But I thought there was a lot of really beautiful imagery in it. Plus, Sydney Sweeney, her acting in this is so good. It's so good. It's worth a watch. It's on Netflix. No, Hulu, I believe. So the basic synopsis for the movie is an American nun embarks on a new journey when she joins a remote convent in the Italian countryside. However, her warm welcome quickly turns into a living nightmare when she discovers her new home harbors a sinister secret and unspeakable terrors. Starring Sydney Sweeney as Cecilia, Benedetta Porcaroli, She plays Sister Gwen. Alvaro Morte is Father Saul Tedeschi. That's the name. And I would say this movie also is very similar to Rosemary's Baby in a sense, kind of. I think if you have bad entity impregnating woman and like conspiracy to keep the woman at bay, it's always going to come off as Rosemary's Baby now. I guess that's just always, that's just how it's going to be. And a lot of this movie, it builds. It's a slow burn, I would say. What really carried me through it was there is a strong sense of mystery within it, but also Sydney Sweeney's acting the whole time. She just looks taken aback. I think she does that like on the verge of crying face really, really well.
You are with child.
And that is used a lot in this. You can sense the unease that she has as we see her work through the trimesters. And that's how the movie is split up by trimester, which love. Going with the seasons, and it gives it a very cyclical structure that makes it feel planned. Like the pregnancy itself, it's an intentional thing. It's going with the seasons. And when spring finally comes, that's when, And of course, as the story goes on, the conspiracy becomes more and more clear, or just the sense that something is wrong. I don't want to give too much away from the movie. It has what I would say is probably going to be considered like a very brutal ending. It just kind of is what it is, but I love horror that really pushes boundaries and pushes people to be uncomfortable. So I guess trigger warning and spoiler warning if you don't want to know what happens at the very end, but I'm just going to give like the just heads up like right out the gate. So click off now if you don't want to know or just skip ahead. She gives birth to the baby outside and smashes it with a rock. You don't see it. It's very Rosemary's Baby once again, where it focuses in on her the whole time. The whole time, from when she gets out of the tunnel that she's crawling through away from Father Tedeschi, she gives birth standing upright and then bites the umbilical cord and smashes it with a rock. But the camera is on her the entire time. You don't ever see the child, which that's very Rosemary's Baby. I also find it interesting that there's a period right before they discover that they do discover she's pregnant, and they are interrogating her like the head deity, whatever, deity of the church comes and is asking her these very intimate, very personal, invasive questions. And she makes the note to specify, I have never had relations with a man or woman. I think it's interesting. There's a lot of body horror in this one as well. She's like throwing up teeth, and I believe there's a fingernail scene in there, branding on the bottom of feet. There's a lot of body horror, so fair warning there. I would not say it's super gory. It is, but it isn't. It uses it wisely, I would say. The ending is gory. Duh. And of course, there's so much religious iconography throughout the movie, so many religious symbols, and I would say direct metaphors to the iconography of Christianity as well. And it subverts it. It definitely makes you feel an unease just because it's like perverting these things that like are so instilled even in society when it comes to morals and stuff like that. It's really kind of like unsettling in that sense. You're watching these walls that our society has put up over the centuries being broken down. You also might be wondering, like, how does she get pregnant? Easiest way to describe it, artificial. She is presented with what we are told is one of the stakes that was hammered through Jesus Christ's hand on the cross. And that's when she completely loses consciousness and wakes up the next day. And it's also like kind of a dream sequence. Once again, very Rosemary's Baby. I don't think the nail is actually like what did it. We find out later along what's been happening. Spoiler alert, once again, it was Father Tedeschi. He's been trying to biologically engineer the perfect second coming of Christ or an antichrist to leash upon the world. And all other attempts have failed. But for Cecilia, it worked with her. She has a whole backstory about how she became a nun from America, because it's not modern times, but I believe it's supposed to be like 30s to maybe possibly even 60s. So, or maybe it's even sooner than that. I'm gonna be honest, it's been a minute since I watched the movie. So I'm just going by notes and what I can remember, but it's not modern. So in relation to the books, now I just chose to do this one, and then very shortly after I saw The Last Omen, and that one is very referential to another possession movie as well, called The Possession. It's with Isabella Andrani, I believe. It's a German or French film, but it is in English, I think. And it used to be hard to find. You can find it streaming nowadays somewhere. If you really know horror, you know of The Possession. It's such a beautifully heartbreaking story of like marital abuse. It is mainly marital abuse, and just like that moving on and how it eats away at some people that find themselves in those relationships. It's older, but it's such an iconic movie. And I mean, there are direct references to it. The subway scene when the possession happens and she gives birth in the subway, that is directly referenced in The Last Omen. So I find it interesting that there's a lot of these very referential movies coming out that refer back to the originals that happened during that pivotal moment in time, and they're all coming back up again at the same time. I don't think that's coincidental, But in Powers of Horror, an essay on objection, we are going to call Semiotics of Biblical Abomination. I know. We're just going to read a little bit. Okay, this is reading hour story time. There's not too much in this chapter that I have, highlighted and whatnot. So, interpretations of biblical impurity are roughly speaking divided along two lines of persuasion. The first considers biblical impurity as a condition internal to Jewish monotheism. I don't think it has anything to do with specifically Jewish people. I think that's just like where it traces back to. Intrinsically dependent on divine will, since the impure is what departs from divine precepts. Far from being a demonic force alien to divinity, impurity would then be a kind of neutralization of taboos, which Immaculate does. Like I said, it takes those things that we know from religion and just society, because our society is based around so much religion and the practices within it, and it's taking that out, flipping it on its head, and presenting it to you in a way that neutralizes and normalizes it. A very clear kind of example of that would be, I think, the very beginning when Cecilia gets to the monastery and she's talking with one of the head nuns who's showing her around, and she's very almost thoughtless when it comes to the death of the patients there, the people that they are taking care of, which, like, I understand her reasoning. She says death is a part of every day here. You get used to it. I get that, but, like, it's still, you know, you know, like, a nun shouldn't be speaking that way, right? So it's that flipping and normalizing. Peculiar to rites of defilement, which happens as well. Cecilia is defiled, and she, in return, defiles the creation, owing to the fact that it is subordinate to the will of God. Now, y'all know I'm not a religious person at all. Spiritual, but I'm not religious. I don't identify with any major religion or anything like that. But I find it extremely fascinating. As I see it, Kristeva, biblical impurity is permeated with the tradition of defilement. In that sense, it points to, but does not signify, an autonomous force that can be threatening for divine agency. I shall suggest that such a force is rooted historically in the history of religions and subjectively in the structuration of the subject's identity, in the cathexis of maternal function, mother-woman reproduction. Reproduction and motherhood, I don't want to say this and come off rude, but it is the ultimate defilement. And that's why Mary, or Cecilia, the Virgin Mary, had to be virginal. It's that initial sin. I think that gets more into kind of like Catholicism ideologies, the idea of the original sin, that we are born from sin and from there on we like must save ourselves, that kind of mentality. But that fear of that original sin somehow always gets placed upon the mother. To the extent that the temple is the law, one is biblically pure or impure only with respect to social order. That is, respect to the law or the cult. So, Cecilia is the odd one out. And the cult that surrounds her, they have created the norms. So Cecilia, who's normal to outside society, is now the taboo force within these walls. There's also a lot of conversation about pure/impure, what makes something pure versus what makes something not. And fire usually is really kind of linked to like a cleansing in many different religions and cultures, but in Christianity as well. Okay, so that's a little bit into powers of horror. Objection. The chapter goes much more in depth, but I don't feel it necessarily has to do with this movie that we are talking about, mostly because from then on it goes into like actual motherhood where Cecilia, she stops at. So but we are going to dive into the monstrous feminine as well. Just figured this will be a nice little warm-up to come back in. The next movie review that we do over here is going to be The Substance, and that one is going to be very in-depth. Very. It's going to take me a long freaking time. I have about 3 pages of notes, and I'm only 5 minutes into the movie. So, gonna be a long one, guys. Bear with me. So, the chapter that I am referencing in Creed is Woman as Monstrous Womb. And this also ties back into what we were getting into with an essay on objection, because it goes into that fear of a woman's reproductivity. Woman, because of her reproductive capabilities, is not far removed from the world of nature. Her generative function positions her on the side of the abject, outside of societal norms. I know, it doesn't sound good. Let's just remember, this is a feminist book. I don't think it's necessarily anti-woman to point out how some aspects of society view the role of women, especially within religious circles, I guess. But I know, it doesn't sound good. An abject creature not far removed from the animal world, and one dominated totally by her feelings and reproductive functions. Again, I don't agree with this statement. Her ability to give birth links her directly to the animal world and to the great cycle of birth, decay, and death. That's why there's that negative connotation with it. It's not the link to life, it's the link to death. Awareness of his links to nature reminds man of his mortality and of the fragility of the symbolic order. Kristeva, so this one, Creed, is directly referencing this essay, traces the representation of the birthing woman as unclean back to the representation of impurity in the Bible. Leviticus draws parallel between the unclean maternal body and the decaying body. The two are associated through childbirth. Evocation of the maternal body in childbirth induces the image of birth as a violent act of expulsion through which the nascent body tears itself away from the matter of maternal insides. Which, that last paragraph that we really went into there, that's the ending of Immaculate, in my opinion. I don't want to go too in depth with that again, but it's the forceful ripping of this life force from the mother. And then in Christianity, abjection is interiorized, so that fear that most people would push onto something else within Christianity, it becomes internal. An essential trait of those evangelical attitudes or narratives is that abjection is no longer exterior. It is permanent and comes from within. An individual who appears clean on the outside may be corrupt on the inside. The dichotomy of pure/impure is transformed into one of inside/outside. And that is very specific as well to the physical confines of the convent that Cecilia is in, but also in the final scenes before she kills the child. She is crawling out of a tunnel from the basement, the bowels of the cathedral, crawling through rocks, dirt, and she's also bloody as well. So she herself is literally being birthed from this place of conspiracy, having to rip back the bushes to pull herself out of the womb of this cathedral. She herself represents a birthed child. The inside outside, even of this cathedral, it relates to that inside outside of us, our own human forms. And with pregnancy, that abject fear of there's this thing, this foreign thing growing inside of me. Where do I end and it begins? The woman represents the utmost in abjection, for it contains a new life form which will pass from inside to outside, bringing with it traces of its contamination, blood, afterbirth, feces. And inside/outside, that abjection, that goes all the ways back to childhood. Potty training, even. That's used in that discussion, this concept of this thing that is from me, but it's not. That's something that psychologists have dived into when it comes to developmental learning with children, and specifically little kids, toddlers, babies. I mean, I think it's fascinating. Representations of the birth scenario in these films point to the split between the natural world of the mother and the paternal symbolic, which is regulated by a completely different set of rules. Rules that reinforce proper civilized codes of behavior and the clean and proper body. Now, the fact that the paternal aspect is what gets associated with the clean, the order of society, misogynistic, very. But that's also very clearly represented in Immaculate as well, with Father Tedeschi, his immaculate, even the lab where the most defiling and the most ungodly things are happening, spotless. It's perfectly clean. It's a representation of even the inner bowels of this thing are kept in order by the masculine energy, and the masculine energy is the antagonist in this case. It is woman's fertilizable body which aligns her with nature and threatens the integrity of the patriarchal symbolic order. That's where that internalized fear comes from. The act of birth is grotesque because the body's surface is no longer closed, smooth, and intact. Rather, the body looks as if it may tear apart, open out, reveal its innermost depths. It is this aspect of the pregnant body, a loss of boundaries, that the horror film emphasizes in its representation of the monstrous. And I think in this sense, that loss of boundary is also a loss of boundary that I think Cecilia has with her religion. She's believed this. She believes in her religion, in her God, and yet she feels violated by it. She didn't allow this. She didn't have consent in it. It's that subversion, that kind of like perverting a holy thing. But I think it looks at it through a newer and more nuanced lens, and a lens that I think is much more favorable to women. Just going to say that. I think, unfortunately, there is an inherent misogyny that comes with religious horror. And I mean, that started with Rosemary's Baby, and long before that, too. Even Nosferatu, which I would not necessarily consider fully religious, but the idea of like women so easily taken aback and seduced, like it goes back so far. And that's why I think I gravitate more heavily towards feminist psychology and philosophers, if you want to call them that, theorists, when it comes to horror, because horror and society in general has been so directly against women, queer people, people of color, that those are the ones that are most represented in these subgenres. But now it's becoming more known. And right now, we're in another pivotal point in culture, history, and just society in general, that these things are starting to come up again, these conversations. And the 60s to the 70s to the 80s was such a transformative period. I think, the 2000s to the 2010s to the 2020s, and now these next few years leading into the 2030s, it's going to be a massive cultural shift. And I think movies are ushering that in subliminally. But yeah, this was a little ranty. A little bit ranty. We didn't get too into the movie. I didn't want to get drudged up with small details. So we just referenced really what I thought was important to note that related to the other readings. But yeah, do have a bunch of newer people here that maybe have not seen one of the movie reviews before. I reference these books a lot and some other ones. The first one is The Monstrous Feminine: Film, Feminism, and Psychoanalysis by Barbara Creed. And then Powers of Horror: An Essay on Abjection by Julia Kristeva. And if I use the other ones, I will give titles, all that. So if you guys want to look them up, I will say this one, I think, was on the more expensive side because it was harder to get a copy of. But there are tons of free like PDFs out there that you guys can read if you're interested in it. I really love the psychology behind horror and just the genre in general. So that's the angle I come at it from. But I know a lot of people don't approach horror like that. But yeah, I want to know your thoughts, guys. So let me know down in the comments. Like and subscribe, all that. Like I said, the substance will be our next one, but it's going to take me a minute, so just bear with me. I'm sorry. I'll try to think of some other stuff that we can throw in there. Definitely like the Dracula season finale. I'm going to try to get that out for you tomorrow. I'm going to try. Thank you so much, you guys. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. Take care.